I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Ed Lawless. Ed is the Executive Director of Learning and Innovation at the Qatar Foundation. Ed spent many years prior to his current role working in international schools around the world. And in this conversation, we'll be discussing a range of topics covering professional development in schools, including current best practices, how schools can leverage their own staff to optimize professional learning, and how you build buy-in amongst staff to engage fully in professional learning opportunities. So yeah, great to have you on this discussion, Ed.
Very good to be here, Max.
Awesome. So yeah, if we could just maybe start with, if you want to just do a quick introduction of yourself, a bit about your professional journey today, that would be great.
Sure. Education, English teacher from start and still there in my soul, deep in my soul. So a high school English teacher in New York State public schools for a little while I was studying my PhD, and I think I wanted to be the Indiana Jones of literature back then, but opted to become a high school teacher and left the United States in 1987 and held international school teaching and administrative jobs in France, Singapore, Australia, UK, in Oxford, when I started working with Pomoja Education and the online IB diploma program courses, then into Japan and Tokyo for a few years, working with school group there, in China and Hong Kong with the Harrow School Group, and now here in Qatar with the Qatar Foundation and pre-university education. Generally, been working with school groups and most part international baccalaureate, and spent a few years, as you know, working directly for the international baccalaureate and as regional manager for professional development for Asia Pacific. Yes.
Brilliant stuff. Fantastic. So yeah, so diving straight into it. So in your experience, having worked in, like you said, many international schools and school groups and education settings, how adept would you say are schools at understanding their own professional development learning needs for their staff?
I'm going to qualify all of my answers before we get started with one thing. This is not going to be a research-based, highly academic discussion, if that's okay with you, Max.
No, good.
my experience in professional development really comes from the School of Hard Knocks more than anything else. And while I could quote all the big names, I prefer to quote life experience, because I think in some ways that's what resonates most with our schools and our school leaders. And that's what they understand. And in your question about how adept schools are at their understanding of professional development needs of their staff, it depends on how you define adept. It depends on what they consider is enough. And frankly, I don't think there's consistency in that standard. Sometimes for some schools, adept is, it's good enough. Yeah, we throw some money at it and keep them happy. Others, very robust, very competitive with themselves and challenging themselves to be healthy and professional learning communities that go from strength to strength. And so I guess the first thing, it depends on your context and your definition of adept, I'd say. The second, I'd say, is it depends upon the school's capacity to identify evidence-based needs. And that's not always readily available in school community. There might be a lot of data, but data that's usefully and relevantly interpreted from all angles, that's another story. So evidence-based needs, I would say, in two directions. Top-down, strategic objectives. In other words, to what degree does the organization know where it's headed? Have they defined their strategic objectives, and do they know where they need to go? And what are the implications in that top down? And I know I'm being brutally vertical in that, but those are the facts, aren't they? That schools know where they want to go and they want their staff to get there.
Yeah.
But there's a big gap because sometimes schools aren't very clear in defining that for their staff. And secondly, it depends on their capacity to clearly identify the evidence-based needs from the bottom up at the individual degree. And what I mean by their individual degree is not just their capacity to get to where they want to go, but sometimes even their dispositions and interests in getting there. Sometimes schools pivot and move in directions without really gauging whether their staff wants to come with them in that direction, let alone whether they're able to. But in terms of the bottom up, I think it's about measuring and having reliable evidence about where the staff currently are regarding those organizational needs and their dispositions and their competencies. Also, where their staff want to be, not necessarily regarding their performance, but regarding their career aspirations. I've been amazed how many times I've done performance review with staff and asked them questions about how I'm doing as a manager or where they see themselves in 5 years, and how many staff will go, nobody usually asks me those questions. And for me, that should be bread and butter, to find out what is the staff and teacher want to do. And frankly, one of the most frustrating conversations I've had with staff are staff who feel compelled to take a promotional trajectory into administration out of the classrooms that they love, and go, why can't I be promoted and have, let's be blunt, higher rewards, both professionally and remuneration, but stay in the place where it matters instead of being promoted out of the place which is not my comfort zone necessarily, but my expertise. But anyways, I'm getting into the long grass on that. Where does staff want to go? And the third, which obviously is a little bit controversial, is how do you know where staff are struggling? And that's what I mean. Do you have the evidence to capture candid, trustworthy assessments of where staff are performing, in their own capacity, in their own eyes, and in the lines of their line manager? So
yeah, and just sort of, I suppose, considering some of those best practices with regards to, whether it's top down or bottom up, how do you put those systems in place to identify those schools' various needs or individual needs of those staff? What sort of tangible, practical best practices have you come across in your experience working?
Some of the best practices have been, and this is a tough bridge to cross, is being shoulder to shoulder with your HR systems. That means, do you have clear and accessible education language in layman's terms that everybody is speaking in the community? Too many times, too much educational language and jargon distances parents, students, and sometimes colleagues. But if you have just layman's terms, concepts, and vocabulary that especially your HR team can come to the table on and say, I get that. So you're making sure that your HR teams are asking questions or recognizing your language, you know what I mean, in their assessment of where staff are. And that's key. That's key to me. And then making sure that you have those reliable quantitative and qualitative metrics. It could be KPIs, it could be self-evaluation, it could be peer evaluation, it could be classroom observation. And of course, the best schools I know how to distinguish facts from judgments. That teachers' examination results are not their performance indicators. They are a reflection of something, but not that. So those are the points where you start conversations, not end them. So there's all kinds of important data sets. It could be student satisfaction. I don't find a lot of schools that are doing what we started doing here is a school climate index, where school by school and across the community, we're judging the hidden curriculum. We're not judging it, we're trying to tap into how happy are our communities? How happy are our staff? How happy are they in terms of their well-being and their progress and their achievement? So there are all kinds of systems and data sets that you can create. But that's actually the third piece. It's not just the language and the systems in terms of speaking the same language, but is the data coming down pipes that are reliable? Because you need to be able to collate, analyze, and sometimes in a systemic way, just press a button and sort it and go, what are the numbers telling us? And let that start a more profound individual or focus group discussion to define needs. And one more thing, Max, I would say, we've only talked about needs. Schools sometimes are very weak at identifying needs. They're even weaker at identifying priorities. Because you could have a whole room full of needs, but trying to get everybody and the stakeholders together to determine, okay, let's put these in a rank order and how we're going to address them, that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
I sound depressing already, don't I, Max?
No. It's just so multifaceted, isn't it? It's there's so many moving parts to, there's the needs of having to record it, but then with that data, what do you do with it? And it's massive. It's a massive task, isn't it? And it's just such a fundamental thing that underpins everything that a school does, doesn't it? And like you said, the well-being of the staff, it's just something as simple or as complicated as that is so key to try and measure. I mean, do you have any advice on how you've gone about trying to measure that with regard to sort of the well-being piece? That's obviously a buzzword, but it's fundamental.
No, so we have, and I won't go into the long grass of the types of questions, but we have questions about their own satisfaction, their own well-being, their own sense of safety and safeguarding, to what degree they're in their community. And, that goes for all students. And, some of those questions have actually even been modified for some students in the community so that they're able to access and contribute that. And as well as, the parent community as well. It's important that we're getting that 360-degree perspective. As I said, now it was a long slog and the team has done a great job, but it's the first time we've been through it where they've just crunched that data. They've provided individual reports to each school. And now that each school is sitting back and going through, okay, let's go through the key indicators. What are our surveys, our satisfaction surveys to staff saying? What is our school climate, our needs analysis that we're putting out to everybody? What do our school climate surveys say? What do our own kind of external assessments say in terms of our IB evaluation data, our CIS or NEASC or middle states recommendation? And we're really just bringing that all together to heads of schools so that they can collate it into saying, okay, well, here's my snapshot. Now, what we purport to be doing, and this is the first time we've done it, is on March 21st, get everybody in one room for 2.5 hours and workshop that data. Workshop that data so that by the time we come out, we will have hopefully 3 bundles. What are the priorities that all schools have? What are the priorities that some schools have? And what are the priorities that are unique to your school alone? And, frankly, that's an essential activity before you can do anything like budgeting, and seeing in the collective, how can we now leverage this collective need so that we can get more competitive rates on affordable solutions, that we can, instead of, as these siloed communities where one school goes out and finds the solution and then they crow about that solution to everybody else. And everybody goes, well, why wasn't I invited? And it's that kind of look at it. When the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, I blame the brain, So we're trying to make some connections and be more shoulder to shoulder in our PD planning. And it's going well. It's going very well.
And now just sort of touching on those opportunities, those professional development opportunities and services. Generally speaking, from what you've seen in your career, how good are schools at sourcing relevant and suitable professional development opportunities and services?
You see, this is one of those dangerous questions. You should be. Two things. And I'm going to use a simple word that's reductive, but what are your criteria for trust? Trust is what it's all about. Who do you trust and why? So sometimes who you knew or who is really hamstringing schools, or who's got the flashiest presentation through LinkedIn or who's trending, I'm amazed at how good educators have become at self-promotion, all right, and educational specialists. And bravo to them. They're doing real, and some of them are really, it's not just fluff, obviously. If they've got that reputation, it's for a reason. But, if you don't have clear objective criteria to gauge what your solutions are, then you're going to be in trouble. It's going to come down to personal preference of school leadership. It's going to come down to personal trust of who you know. And I've always been a firm believer that two things: good ideas can come from any direction, and sometimes the answer is in your own backyard. And again, that's trust. But we know profits are never recognized in their hometown, right? So in terms of the latter, I don't think schools are good enough at canvassing for their strengths and celebrating their strengths and cross-pollinating those strengths within or across the community. And I think schools could be better at that. We're certainly taking strides to do that. And in terms of then seeking external solutions, in terms of some of the objective criteria, here, obviously, we work on the basics of professional profile. What is the reason for your recognition? What's your past experience or qualifications? Is it publications? Is it research? We know, are people doing more than trending? And are they doing more than just a one-hit wonder? Coming in, stirring, and then moving on. But aside from the professional profile, is there contextual relevance in their cultural responsiveness? Is it the right fit for your school need? Or is it the latest thing that everybody else is doing, so I need to get on board? Is it contextually relevant to your school needs? And here, especially at Qatar, cultural responsiveness is just as important. Every day I'm very careful with this face about what I'm recommending, in a community that I've only been here for 6 months. So my job is to really ask empowering questions and tease those needs out and help to match them. And it sounds like a corny phrase, but we try to be global and local, and recognize and respect that we need to be locally rooted but globally minded when we're finding those solutions. That's core to the type of students that we develop, but it should also be core in terms of the type of PD that we source. But look, the other three key things I say is it accessible? And accessibility here for me means time, language, and cost. Is it going to be, anybody who says, oh, I only do online, and I only do it face to face, and I only do it under these conditions, and that's just not going to work for most school groups that are on a budget. Is it sustainable? To what degree is what they're going to do going to empower the institution to be independent rather than build dependencies for future services? And I don't mean to be a suspicious New Yorker, but because I think most professional development specialists are the former. I think they are authentically empowering communities towards self-regulation and independence in that side. But that's an important part of sustainability. And the last I would say is impact, measurable impact. And that's hard. That's really hard. I don't know what the answer is, because isn't that the Holy Grail? Isn't that what most people are looking for?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you mentioned there something about around sometimes the solution is actually in your own backyard, and a lot of schools can leverage fantastic knowledge and expertise within their own staff, can't they? So what are some of the ways that schools can leverage their own staff and internal expertise to optimize professional development and learning in their school?
So one of the things I love about, and I have always liked about being an educator, is the intangible rewards, right? The fact is, educators tend to be motivated by other things than the bottom line. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be doing this. But for us, sometimes those intangible rewards is just being celebrated, being recognized, or even just the altruistic and personal reward of seeing what help somebody else. I mean, as an educator, that's what we do with students. That's what we should be doing with our colleagues as well. Although I've always found it fascinating how the same educators who in a classroom of rampant 12-year-olds can master and control that class get all self-conscious and nervous in front of their peers or adults. It just boggles my mind, that they're lion tamers by day, but then nervous about going into what should be one of the safest environments possible. Max, so I don't know if I answered your question about concrete ways, but look, obviously, vertical and horizontal learning communities, whether they're face-to-face, job alike, or whether they're online forums, this is really, really easy. And one thing I did when I was with the Harrow Group in Hong Kong, working with the Harrow schools, is we simply made sure that we were creating professional learning communities and keeping them going by every week a different leader would select an article or a research piece or even a blog that they found was relevant. We translated it either from English to Chinese or from Chinese to English. We gave a few bylines and perspectives. We just, every week, we threw it into the discussion forum as chum in the water to try to stir discussion. And we asked that person to facilitate the forum, and we all know that discussion forums can become ghost towns if they're not facilitated in professional learning communities online. But this really did start to get a little bit of buzz going, I think. And to that end, sometimes incentivizing it by recognizing the people who are most active in those communities, that makes a difference.
I suppose it just builds that cadence, doesn't it? If you've got a simple feed, it doesn't take much to sort of put something in there and start a conversation or show something that inspired you. It just goes to help building that culture, doesn't it? Of everyone together, everyone not being scared to showcase something that you were inspired by and not worrying about whether someone else might feel the same way or whatever.
Exactly. And it's not that hard to just set up what you think are essential and kind of high quality RSS feeds and news feeds, and once a week drag and drop and go, hey, put it out there. I mean, as I said before, this happens in LinkedIn all the time, doesn't it? And people could easily just piggyback off of those things and comment. So I don't want to sound cynical because I'm not. I mean, these types of social media kind of posts, they're authentic, and people are really doing a good job at stirring opinion and others in chiming in. I think there's a lot that could be done with homegrown talent. The other thing, that I find schools, especially school groups, really don't leverage enough is a resource as PD. Resource repositories, just people saying, hey, share your unit planners, share an assessment strategy, share this, just throwing things into a well-managed community space where, again, if you want, you could set up a micro-credentialing community where people get credits for how much they share and how many likes they get for those shares or feedback on how well people say they use it. But it makes a difference, I think.
Yeah, and that sort of touches on the next question, really, about sort of building and incentivizing in particular. Are there any other sort of things that you've come across? How do you build that buy-in to take it to the next level and incentivize staff and teachers at your school to engage in professional development opportunities?
This is always a painful topic for a couple of reasons. One, and I'm going to be terribly reductive, so if people get angry with me, I apologize up front. But you have two approaches to incentivize, right? It's carrots and sticks, right? Expectations, or recognition versus expectations. And I've seen some school communities that when they say specifically, these are your requirements, this is our expectation. Every teacher must have X number of hours of professional learning per year as part of their contractual obligation. I mean, you'd ask your pilots and surgeons to do that probably because there's a lot at stake, On On the other hand, I don't think that they're as open-handed and flexible about respecting a student-centered, learner-centered culture where you let the teacher drive a large portion of what that means. You let them, oh, sorry, the lights are going out here. So we have an energy switch here.
We
are sustainable here at QF. Yeah, so letting the teacher drive what they do with those hours, or a large portion of it. So what we tried to do, and we did this at Harrow, and I think it's a good concept, is you have 3 strands of professional development opportunities. You have core learning, which is non-negotiable. It's required. It could be new teacher induction, or it could be induction because you have a new system that everybody needs to get their head around. You have professional learning, which is the large part of what does the evidence say you could or should be doing. And then you have shared learning, which we just talked about. How are you being recognized, and are there enough opportunities for you to stand, share, take a bow, and help a colleague? So those are kind of the sticks and the carrots. You know what I mean? If you're incentivizing it and recognizing that, it can work well. But the final, most painful thing that everybody talks about is time. Our schools building, it's the most valuable resource in schools. I hate to say it, and the prep hours in a timetable for staff, not enough. So what's happening? They're staying after school for PD, or are they coming in on the weekends for PD, or are they expected to, during their holidays? That's the hardest thing, really.
And I suppose that again, that sort of reinforces that point of little and often, right? Rather than, it's great having these grand professional development opportunities on offer, and that's absolutely essential. But having that space where it can just be drip fed throughout the day, and not be this great cumbersome thing that teachers have to think about, blocking out hours to do outside of their teaching time. It can be something that, like you said, that community where people can share resources, share ideas, share inspiration.
And that's it. If it can be agile and flexible around their time, their dispositions, and their interests, and still capture data. And you know what? Again, I hate to sound like a techie, but my years at Pomoja made me realize that, and it was a real challenge. We had 125 or so teachers from around the world in, I think, 12 different departments with department heads. We had virtual learning professional learning communities, or staff rooms. And those heads of department did an amazing job of not just the induction, but also moderation and ongoing professional development, management of asynchronous forums. And, they just kept it going of themselves. And that was essential because, think about it, you might be in a department of 20 teachers in our online psych course, coming from 20 different schools, with 20 different mindsets about how to write reports or what assessment standards look like. And we had to really constantly bring these people together on their own terms when they were available. And look, that's where it taught me that it can be done. It also taught me that sometimes a good PD isn't about me. It's about getting out of the way, so that it's about the teachers and what they need under the conditions that they want. But that's back to trust. Not every institution can be that trusting. Because look, frankly, because some schools have been burned under those conditions, potentially. But anyway.
And then sort of looking at that, the measuring piece and sort of measuring the impact. What are some of the tools that schools and leaders can use to measure or tell whether a professional development initiative is working, making a difference?
Again, with my reductive kind of vocabulary, I look at it in 3 ways: engagement, satisfaction, and impact. Engagement is, if you built it, did they come? And that's the lowest measure, isn't it? But were they sitting in the seats and paying attention, or were they online and following? Did they complete those 3 days in that IB workshop, and did they get their certificate? But that's all we have, frankly, is engagement. After that, satisfaction. And I know some people would say it should be learning, but no, I just say, look, if you built it and they came, did they like it? And by like it, I mean, did they find it valuable? Did they find it rewarding? Did they find it relevant? And that's hopeful, but that's the next step up. You have to have a metric of, well, you want to know in a survey right away, and we build surveys so that they don't get their certificate until they've answered the survey, so we can get 100% feedback. Well, I mean, you have to, but it's because we want the unvarnished truth. Was it contextually relevant? Is it going to make a difference to your practice, and how could it be better? The third impact is the higher order, and if you built it and they came, did they like it, and did they use it, and to what effect? Those are longitudinal studies that take time. And so one of the things that we're doing here is we're trying to build in cycles and track activities so that we can come back in focus groups with them 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later. What do you do? I mean, how often before they get survey fatigue and just say, leave me alone, will you? It's a hard thing to gauge, but you do want to know. And partly because that's where your shared learning comes in. If you get somebody who has actually used it and can crow about it, then put them back on a stage and say, show us how this training made a difference to your practice. But look, at real impact obviously comes in terms of learner outcomes. Those are long-term longitudinal indicators. And for some learning outcomes, we all know there's so many variables at play. Hormones might make a difference better than PD to student outcomes. Have they grown up? Are they more mature? What changed their behavior and their outcomes? I hate to say it, but there are a lot of variables at play, so
yeah.
I don't know.
And sort of then thinking about measuring PD. Obviously, in an ideal world, we'd measure it all, and we just use the ones that have the greatest impact and highest engagement and the highest satisfaction. But should and can all PD be measured? Are there some really effective professional development initiatives or things that teachers and staff can do that can't be measured?
No, I think that there's some. I think everything can be measured. I think the validity of the measure and the end thing, again, as I said before, there are facts and there are judgments, and they're different. I think at the end of the day, those evaluations, the numbers, they're a little bit like funhouse mirrors, or they make you look at it and go, ooh, do I really look like that? Or did it really? It's supposed to spur reflection and self-inquiry as a practitioner, and really, I think the measure of impact comes in the dialogue with the practitioner. Because otherwise, statistical impact, I don't mean to be a naysayer. There are people out there who are researchers who are much better equipped than me to answer that question. Again, as you know, just from my demeanor, I take a more cultural approach and personal approach to the PD agenda than the statistical. And I'd always say that the statistical is an indicator of success, but it's not success.
Fantastic. That's just such great insights, and that brings us to the end of the discussion. Actually, it's flown by. Thanks so much, Ed, for taking that time. Some great insights that I'm sure many of our members will find so useful. So looking forward to.
No, that's great. And look, I just close by saying, in terms of PD, sadly, it's a little bit like in school budgets. The first thing they cut are the arts, or sports, or the things like that. Well, and in school budgets, PD is always under scrutiny because what you said, the bottom line is, how do we know the return on investment? And again, I'll come back to that word on trust. I remember saying to somebody who was in a previous school, the financial manager, when it came to PD, or I said, in the accounts of goodwill, you only know when you're in the red when it's too late. you know, and so in terms of the risk analysis, why would you hedge your bets? You know, why would you take that risk? And the other great memory I have is when I was at Hale School in Perth in Western Australia, I worked under a guy named John Verarity, who is a former cricket legend in Australia, which qualifies you to do almost anything, of course.
Yeah.
But he happened to be a great educator and school leader as well. And I remember he was challenged by his board about the expense of staff having free lunch in the dining hall with the boarders. And they said, this is an expensive item, you know, it's all just going to staff. And he said, no, that's distributed across our pastoral care budget and our professional development budget. And they said, what's the logic in that? He said, well, when that staff member walks into that dining hall, he's going to make two choices. Do I sit next to a student? In which case, 9 times out of 10, the conversation is going to be a form of pastoral care. Or do I sit next to a colleague? In which case, 9 times out of 10, he's going to talk about practice, and that's going to be professional development. And that was the end of the conversation. You know? Now, there was no measurable return on investment, but that single thing, he was absolutely right. You know, it was an intangible return on investment that contributed to the goodwill, and it contributed to the work ethic, and it brought teachers closer to students and teachers closer to colleagues. So yeah. I know that's not statistically valid, but it's probably worth considering for something.
But it's all these little things that will add up, won't they? You know, after a while, you know, it's just these little tweaks and little adjustments that you can make to bring people closer together, foster that collaboration, communication. It can only be a good thing, I think, ultimately, can't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Fantastic. Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much, Ed, for your time. That was
no worries. Fantastic. The sun is setting. That's symbolic here. So leave me to it, Max. It's been lovely speaking with you. Lovely speaking.
Fantastic. Looking forward to maybe doing a part 2, Ed. Thanks so much for your time again.
Thank you.